Okay, so I'm going to quickly get this over to Kristen, but I wanted to cover a couple of points first. First of all, during this talk, it is going to be between Kristen and I. And the reason is because we really want to make sure that Kristen has all the space she needs to speak. So I'll be asking her questions. And then if you have any particular thoughts or questions that you would like to direct to Kristen, please just direct message them to me through the chat feature, and I'll work them in as I can. We also hope to have time to do a question and answer at the end a little bit and just some conversation, because again, we're normal people. We like to talk to humans. I think that's something that I've said to Kristen and she agrees with. So the reason that we're having this session is because as a male, I can comfortably say that we are in a society that sort of squeezes a victim and a survivor into this place where they have to determine between telling the story, telling their truth, the truth, and having to deal with the potential of extra trauma of not being believed. For whatever reason, we try to protect, we end up protecting perpetrators because we are afraid of how it will affect us if we have to admit what we lived around and what was able to happen around us. So the only way to start to change that and to start making it a place where, rather than being safe for perpetrators, that it is safe for the storyteller, for the person who has lived the experience, for the survivor, is to start to listen. Now, lastly, I want to acknowledge one thing that's incredibly important, and it came from another book that Kristen and I have read, and it's from James Baldwin, and he fully acknowledged in one of his later books that was recalling his past experiences, that the memory is imperfect, particularly when it deals with trauma. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that right up front, because this is a recollection of something that the body and mind tried to protect us from, something that never should have happened. So if a detail is slightly off, guess what? I can try to recall most events from yesterday, and I'm going to have details slightly off. So we're not going to look for ways to nitpick or pull apart the story. We have to accept it as the truth because it is the truth that Kristen lives. All right, lastly, Kristen felt it was really important to point out that this story, because it's going to reference people and some people that you may know, whether it be directly by name or by reference. I don't believe we're going to do a lot of names particularly, but again, it depends on how the story goes. The important part that Kristen wanted you to understand is that this is not meant to shame or to embarrass anybody. However, we are going to talk about the interaction and how the people that were surrounding the situation, parents, friends, how they were within reach of the situation and how their interaction with the situation and with Kristen's experience come into play, because I think that's where most of us find ourselves. So with anything further to do, I'm actually going to jump off of Facebook Live now, and we're going to go ahead and get started. And again, Kristen, this is yours. I'm just here to walk you through. So let's get started. We are off the live stream.
So I'm so excited for this conversation. As many of you know, Chris and I have been involved in this book club group where we have been reading the book Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell. In reading this book, obviously, it deals with a lot of sexual abuse issues, being both the Sandusky trial as well as it touches on the Larry Nassar gymnastics case and the Brock Turner case as well. During reading, repressed traumatic memory was brought up multiple times, especially in reference to the Sandusky case, which really spoke to me as I have realized in my early 20s, mid-20s, that I was actually a victim of repressed traumatic memory. So now I'm just going to give a little bit of backstory on how I came about realizing the trauma I went through and what that was like for me. At age around 25 or 26, I had been dating my then husband for a couple of years. I was finally in a healthy relationship and I was extremely loved. I still am. It's amazing. Um, but when I started to let down my guard and become my safest around my then boyfriend, um, I began to have flashbacks. I began to have memories and dreams that I couldn't really understand because I'd never had them before in this context. I was seeing flashbacks of myself with a neighborhood family friend, an older teenage boy, um, and I was having these memories that I just had never known to have had before. So at that point, when I was about 26, I called my mom. I was confused. I just didn't really understand why I was having these dreams and memories of being sexually abused as a child, by this friend of ours. Um, I spoke to my mom, and she was able to correlate some of what had happened, because she had had conversations with the parent of said boy. Um, some of, just like Chris had said, with repressed memory, we oftentimes forget certain details, certain parts. To this day, there are parts of that conversation and parts of the time period of me becoming aware of my sexual abuse that I have blocked out, um, just with trying to deal with the repressed memories that I had, was almost traumatizing in and of itself. And those are some memories that I cannot fully grasp. Um, I went through a few different stages after realizing that I had been sexually abused as a child and had these repressed memories. I went through a few different stages. At first, I was in disbelief. I was completely confused and just blown away that my mind was able to completely shield myself from this for well over a decade. I was almost at the point of gaslighting myself. I would question reality. I was just extremely confused with the whole situation. I didn't know what to believe. I didn't know what to trust, but I continued to have these flashbacks. I continued to have these memories. And within these memories, many sexual assault victims or sexual abuse victims can understand the same feeling. It's very similar to that feeling you have when you're, and I said this to Chris too when we were talking the other night, that feeling at the end of the day when you're laying in bed and you're replaying a situation that is just so embarrassing, something that you're like, oh my gosh, I wish that that didn't happen, or something that you're ashamed of, and you just get that wave of shame and almost nausea and just being uncomfortable. That was the feeling that I would get every time I would relive these moments. I would have the same exact feeling that I had as a child while being sexually abused. It would come in just full waves. So it took a while for me to really grasp and to come to terms that this was my lived reality, that I was able to block this out for so long. So that was at 26. I didn't really speak to many people about it. I told my best friend, I told my mom, I told my boyfriend. We talked about it a little bit, but I didn't really dig into it at that time. It wasn't until I was about 28 where I was having a conversation with another woman who had been sexually abused, and there were people who doubted her when she opened up in front of me in conversation. And I shared my experience at that time. That was a very freeing moment for me. I was able to get a lot out on the table. And honestly, I thought that I was fully healed. I thought that at that point, putting words to what I had gone through had healed me until December 2019, when I experienced a traumatic trigger due to a fight with a family member, where I stormed out of the house and I left. And I found myself that night pulled over on the side of the road, just literally like how you see in the movies, a reel, a complete film reel of many incidents in my life from the time that I was sexually abused all the way up to present time of the person I was. It wasn't until that night that I realized the effect that my sexual abuse had on me throughout my entire middle school years, my entire high school years, into early adulthood, into motherhood. It wasn't until that night that I realized these things, and that I realized that the person I was on the outside wasn't matching the person I was in my heart for the majority of my life. I'm going to actually read right now from the book. And I think that anyone who is also a survivor of sexual abuse will definitely, these words will resonate with you, because when I read them, I was like, oh my gosh, that is me. That is how I felt. And this is from the chapter in the book about the Brock Turner case. And this is actually straight from Emily Doe's letter to Brock Turner. And they preface it by saying that it is brave and eloquent and a powerful reminder of the consequences of sexual assault. That what happens between two strangers in the absence of real consent causes genuine pain and suffering. What happened that night, she said, shattered her. Now, this is her direct quote. This is what Emily Doe, the victim of Brock Turner, stated. She says, my independence, natural joy, gentleness, and steady lifestyle I had been enjoying became distorted beyond recognition. I became closed off, angry, self-deprecating, tired, irritable, empty. The isolation at times was unbearable. She goes on to say more, and she ends with, it is embarrassing how feeble I feel, how timidly I move through life, always guarded, always ready to defend myself, ready to be angry. Those feelings, I realized in reading this, were exactly how I felt from the time I was sexually abused all the way up until very, very recently. I was forced to put on a shell and toughen myself because I was scared all of the time. Now, something that's important to remember in my case especially, and cases that are similar to mine, is that from the time of my sexual abuse, when I was about 8 or 9, all the way up till I was 25, I had no memory, awareness, or knowledge of my sexual abuse. I lived as if it never happened. In my head, I was living as if it never happened. Obviously, my whole demeanor and who I became as a person, or who I appeared to become as a person on the outside, was directly correlated to my abuse and not having it properly dealt with. not receiving therapy and not being cared for how I should have been cared for in those moments.
Kristen, I'd like to ask a question here because I think this is right where you are, and I want to make sure we hit this. Because you mentioned that you didn't have a memory of this, and it sounds like almost immediately. It sounds like your body just literally protected you, which is that's a lot to absorb. As a parent, as a friend. But you mentioned something that started almost sounds like fairly immediately, and it was dreams that didn't make sense. Are you comfortable talking about that?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I think is this a good time to go into that?
Yes, yeah, definitely. So, during this time when I very early, I believe, and all of this that I'm speaking on is things that I have realized retrospectively. I was not aware of any of this as it was going on, as I was living my life as a preteen, teenager, early 20s. I wasn't aware, obviously. So at almost directly after the abuse, I began having sexualized dreams. I was having sexualized dreams with important, close family members where they were abusing me, which I knew was not fact. I knew in my heart, in my head, I knew that these dreams were not reality. And I knew that something was wrong. I honestly thought something was wrong with me. I thought I was sick. I thought it was disgusting. I was having these sexualized dreams about things that I shouldn't have even been aware of. In these dreams, I would be able to feel and see and touch things that in my mind, I had never experienced in reality. These were things that were completely foreign to me in my waking hours. I had no idea what any of it meant, why I was thinking this way, why I was having sexual thoughts. I was ashamed, I was scared, I was confused at all of that. And due to those dreams and those feelings of unsafety and of not being protected, I withdrew from many of the people that cared most about me. I withdrew from family members and I put up a very hard exterior. I would pick fights and and be rough, just rough to be around. I was oftentimes looked at by myself and by others close to me as being a brat, as being selfish, as I would have blow ups that would be basically unexplained over little tiny things. And it would be, oh, there goes Kristen just being Kristen. That is how the situation turned. So as that happened and progressed, with each moment that happened, I would get even harder on myself. I would question, why am I like this? Why am I not happy? I began to experiment with drugs at a very early age. I became, at that point, as a teenager, very sexually promiscuous. I engaged in acts that I am ashamed.
You not only are, your personality starts to reinvent itself, but you are trying to negotiate your own understanding of yourself versus everybody else's understanding of you. And it is so significant, that term, and I'm going to keep on coming back to it, and who you were in your heart. Kristen and I had a wonderful conversation the other night as we were getting ready for this. And I think I want to point that, I want to honor that as well, because Kristen has really put in so much effort for our benefit. And that needs to be honored, understood, and we need to be incredibly thankful because she didn't take this lightly. This isn't just, oh, I'm going to tell my story. This is something that she has had to work to give us as much as she can of herself. And I cannot take that lightly in any way, shape, or form. How are we doing, Kristen? Did you have anything at the moment that you wanted to continue with, or?
No, please go ahead.
So I do want to work with the concept because it is essential from an outsider looking and trying to understand. But you mentioned this term, who you were in your heart. We have a shell, and that's the one that many of us would have interacted with. And that's who you would have known yourself as. So I want to go back a little bit, and this is an interesting question. I'm going to ask you this question in several different forms. But so who are you in your heart at, say, 6 years old?
This is actually also a whole other conversation that we could talk about, because how I can answer that question, how I go back in my mind when it comes to my childhood and much of my life is events of trauma. My first natural memory is breaking my femur when I was 4. So I can tell you with certainty that at around 6 or 7, I had just broken my elbow. And in those years, I was carefree. I was mostly outside running around playing. I would spend hours playing with my dollhouse. I would spend hours playing with the boys outside, getting muddy and dirty with the neighborhood kids. I was very much a free and wild spirit. I was annoying. I was attached to my mom's hip. I would, if she was sitting on the couch, I was right on top of her. I had to have her near me a lot of the time. From that time in my life, one of my greatest memories is laying in bed and having her just sing song after song after song to me. So that's where I was. I was still probably not the easiest child. I think that I've been a little bit difficult probably since the day I was conceived, but I was definitely more of a free spirit.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Oh, you're on mute.
Listen, never perfect about this. I was actually pulling up because if any of you haven't seen it, Kristen wrote a wonderful blog post about her mother, and I had the opportunity to read that yesterday. And there was this one part, and again, this is to also honor relationships, because you mentioned a word called consistent. So this is, we are now before trauma, but it sounds like, if I'm getting this right, Kristen, this is something that was not different at any point. Your mother just, can you talk about the school, being sick at school? I love that.
Oh, so what Chris is referencing here is from that article. And still one of my most common memories. And could probably also be tied into medical trauma, medical history trauma as well. I would oftentimes be the kid in the nurse's office who complained of a stomach ache, a headache, a toe ache, a cheek ache, anything that could ache ached, and I needed to go home. And I would come home, and my mom would have stopped everything in her day that she was doing, and she would make me my comfy spot with my blankets on the couch and put on my favorite Disney movie and just drop everything just to be there to comfort me. She would literally put us, and she would never, and I know she's listening right now as well, she will downplay all of these times in my life. She will say, oh, I was just being a mom. Oh, I was just trying. Oh, you didn't see me doing this thing though, or you didn't see me doing this part. But the reality is she was like she was and remains to be the most amazing person in my life as far as support and comfort and just feeling safe.
This is so excellent for getting a picture of the consistent person, and to hear you talk about these relationships and how you were viewing the world around you. You mentioned something, you mentioned things kind of like a handful or a lot difficult, which is really interesting because what we're talking about prior to trauma. And I think that's important because this is not the first story like this. And again, these are not my stories to tell. So I won't tell other people's without them being here. I have seen a consistency with children who are a nuisance, if you will, or perceived as being a lot to handle. If you can get them out of sight for a few minutes, that's really, you just need a break. Unfortunately, sometimes you might end up in a place where somebody who has predatory tendencies is there to take advantage of that. And I want to point that out because, again, I've seen that multiple times. This is not, again, an accusation, but I think it's important for many of us, our parents, many of us, or if you're just a loved one with a friend, there are opportunities when somebody is a lot to handle. Either way, we have to understand that just because somebody's personality or they might be needy, guess what? Some people really crave or love attention, or not just attention, but affection. Sometimes that need for attention is just saying, is an inability to say, I need affection.
Good.
Excellent. Now, again, you've made it clear that sharing this was not meant to shame anybody or to make anybody feel bad. Now, you mentioned that your family became aware of this, which is, I cannot imagine that as a parent. One thing as a parent, I have started to understand is how much room for forgiveness and for giving a lot of grace to the people that had to deal with scenarios and to deal with trying to figure out how to parent. So I think that we're on the same page there. I hope I'm not speaking over you there. But I do want to ask about what they did or did not tell you then at the time that they were aware of this.
So, and I appreciate you prefacing that in no way am I trying to shame. And my parents, I've had this conversation with them fully. They know that I do not place blame. I do not place any type of responsibility on them for what happened. I do not blame them or feel any type of way about the way they handled the situation, because we're all parents, and we're not all parents are humans, and we're all liable to fail at times, or liable to make the decision that maybe wasn't in the best interest. So at the time of my actual sexual abuse, and obviously I didn't learn this until later on in life because I wasn't aware at the time, but at the time, my parents were made aware of portions of the sexual violence that I had that had happened. I believe that it was very much played down. They were told this information by the parent, who was a close family friend of the boy who, I hate to say boy, but he was a teenager. But they had a conversation with the parents, and my mom did go to my pediatrician at the time and asked, what do we do? Do we take her to counseling? What do we do? And this, like I said, is things that I learned after the fact. At that point, this was in the 90s. There was not much talk about mental health at that time. And my parents were basically told that as long as she's not talking about it, or as long as she's not regressing or showing symptoms or acting different or anything like that, I don't think that we should pursue anything further. So I did not receive help. I never spoke to anybody when it happened. Um, I can't honestly say how long I was aware, or if there was a time that I really was aware directly after leading up. I don't know. That time is lost for me in my brain. I'm not sure if at age 8 or 9 when this happened, if there was any time that I knew what had happened and if I was too scared or too ashamed. But part of the thing with telling my story now is trying to put aside. I know and I am aware how difficult it must be for my parents to hear me talk about these things. I know how I would feel if I had to hear my child talk about things that I wasn't able to protect them from. And I hold that dear and I respect and appreciate that feeling. But at the same time, as a actual survivor and an actual victim, I also have to force myself, and it is a very it's I am very mindful of this, and it's very I try to keep this at the forefront of my head that I cannot feel bad about sharing, and I should not feel the need to protect anyone except myself when it comes to sharing my story, which is something that um that is hard for me. It is very hard for me. I had to stop myself from texting my parents before this conversation, um and stop myself from saying, from kind of prefacing it by saying, I hope you don't take anything the wrong way, or I hope you know how much I love you, but I shouldn't have to say that. And those are things that I know my parents know, but it's a struggle for me. It's just something that I deal with internally. And I think that needs to be noted as well, that that is something that victims and survivors deal with.
So there were pieces here, but trying to fit them together seems like a lot of it had to do with just where you were in society at the moment.
I completely agree. And to bring it back to what you said about you don't know what they would do, what a pediatrician would recommend now. Um, I definitely believe that we are so much more advanced when it comes to mental health, and I know you know this as well. It seemed to my parents at the time that um, I wasn't showing any signs. Looking back on it now, for me, um, every single thing I did was a sign of me screaming for help. Um, from the time when I started to build that hardened shell, and really became to um, retreat into myself and push my family as far away as possible. But the tough thing is, so much of that could be easily chalked up to teenage hormones and to the normal teenage cycle of I hate my mom today, or you know what I mean? So I can understand, but looking back now, I can see so many instances where unbeknownst to me, I was screaming for help. I was acting out in every way possible, hoping to receive attention, affection, and care and protection which ultimately was not granted to me how I so desired it without even realizing that I was desiring it. Because while saying all of that I was screaming for help, I pushed back every chance I got. I retaliated against my parents every single chance I got. I formed horrible relationships with both friends and boyfriends from my early teens all the way up to my 20s. I just filled myself and surrounded myself with negativity. So I can only imagine how difficult that would be to try to dig underneath and to see where this me was really coming from.
We've mentioned the not wanting to place responsibility, and that's, again, we're going to keep on coming back to that. But I think it shows something that we're, in some ways, Kristen, it sounds like you might have been already trying to protect other people from you, the people that you cared about. That once you get to now as an adult, that you are still, though you are the person who has survived, the victim, you are putting every effort you have into protecting your family. Now, I'm not trying to paint you as an angel, because, like you mentioned, in adolescence, you could be held to deal with one way or the other. So now we're going to look at a different age. Who were you in your heart at 20 years old?
So at 20 years old, I had just had my first child. I was a single mother. I was living with my parents. For lack of better words, I was scared shitless. I was terrified. I had become pregnant at 19, and prior to finding out I was pregnant, my relationship with my parents was very rough. As I said, I was completely in self-destruct mode. And because of that, I had pushed everybody who cared about me as far away as possible. And as stated before, I surrounded myself with negativity. I was involved in a very, both emotionally, more so emotionally and physically abusive relationship. And I decided to go ahead and have my daughter by myself as a single mom. But with that, I started to, my relationship with my parents got a little bit better under falsified terms almost. I feel like they fully, once I decided that I was definitely going to go ahead with my pregnancy, they fully rallied behind me and supported me every step of the way. They were second parents to my first daughter, 100%, while also dealing with their lives. And in that, we formed a new kind of relationship and bond, but one that was still underlined by this trauma that I still wasn't fully aware of. And so I was still very much, I would react to events kind of disproportionately. I would blow up in ways that didn't make sense for what was happening. I would react differently to situations than, I don't want to say a normal person would, because who is normal, but there was still something wrong. There was still something not right. I was still very much I was not happy at all. I was not at peace at all. I was scared, and I felt very much alone. Even though my parents were there to help, I felt fully alone almost 100% of the time.
When I'm looking at you now in this, so we're talking in through adolescence, then over a decade, truth default theory, which covers how we interact or perceive an interaction with somebody, whether we perceive that their intention is honest. if the salesman's kind, nice, makes eye contact and shakes your hand here in America, we start to take that as very honest, shows care, that they're trustworthy. What we also do is that if somebody is in a traumatic situation, or is having a trauma response, or is living a trauma response, we are still going to take their behavior as an honest reflection of how they want to interact with us. When somebody is living through this response and trying to make sense of what normal is, because something in her heart knows who she is, and yet trying to be that person creates this next level of shame. So when you said you went to your mom with this, but let's revisit that and that idea of safety, because I think there's an opportunity for us to learn, how can we be that force of safety for somebody who we may never have known? How do we treat people around us so that they're aware that they are safe?
So a large portion of that, I believe, was that all of those years from the abuse up until my early 20s, like 24, honestly, I was just surrounding myself with negativity all the time. Most of my core group of friends were friends when they needed something, or when I could give them something, or for partying. A lot of my acquaintances during those times were just party friends, which is how I turned off my emotions. I would try to numb and dull the pain with whatever choice of drug I chose for that night, whatever amount of alcohol. Being around people was in a toxic type of setting like that was how I was able to not feel pain. So when I was 23, I met my current husband, and that relationship with my husband um, broke down so many walls and so many barriers. He made me feel safe in ways that I had never felt safe before. And I think that my mind just knew that I could deal with this with him by my side. I was able to confront it. But even still, when I first started having my memories come back to me, I thought that I was fully processing and fully healing, but like I said, I wasn't fully, and that didn't come to full fruition until 20 December 2019, when I realized I don't want to be misunderstood anymore. I don't want to be the one running out of the house and leaving a situation and being looked at as someone different than how I viewed myself. I was starting to find self-worth, and I was starting to realize how the trauma had really affected me fully. And with that realization, with the realization um, of how this abuse had formed my whole entire being, it kind of gave me the motivation to want to break that all down, just to have it all come tumble down. I wanted everyone to be aware of everyone who mattered and who was close to me, to be aware of why I was the way I was, and to understand that. And I don't think it was until then that I really reached a point where I could fully look back and recollect all the memories and see that linear progression of how it changed the person I was.